All right, Bad Faith by Lewis Gordon. Bad faith has a colloquial and philosophical history. They, in turn, offer two meanings. The first is linked to law. There, what can testify or enter contact in bad faith, where the meaning involves entering agreements with false intentions. The second philosophical meaning has a circuitous history emerging primarily through reflections from French existential philosophy. This is not to say that the phenomenon described in French existentialism was created by it. Chronicles of that form of bad faith are perhaps as old as mythic reflection. The philosophical form of bad faith addresses the problem of lying to oneself. Unlike the legal model, which involves a lie to others, the philosophical one does not require another being deceived. What is crucial is the focus on the self. In existential phenomenology, which focuses on how problems of existence relate to those of consciousness, bad faith surfaces as a free act of consciousness. In phenomenological terms, consciousness is always of something. This is the intentionality view of consciousness. The something of which there is consciousness is that which appears. In existential terms, it stands out. This is all as well what existence means from the Latin existere. To stand out is to emerge or to appear. Turned back onto itself, the question posed to consciousness is whether consciousness appears. The problem is that consciousness must then become a thing, even though things are objects of consciousness. What kind of thing could consciousness be for it to be an object for itself? Existential phenomenologists, from Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre, through others outside of the European tradition, such as Nishitani Keiji in Japan, or Noel Jabani, Magani, and Magobo P. Moore in South Africa, argue that consciousness is not a thing. It is at best a relationship to things. This offers a core understanding of philosophical treatment of bad faith. It involves attempting to take consciousness out of the relationship through which things appear. Put differently, it is the imposition of non-relationality onto relations. The contradictory elements of bad faith leads to many important observations. The first is that for consciousness to be of something, the thing must be there through which the relationship of being conscious of it is here. This here-there relationship means consciousness must be embodied. If it weren't so, it would be everywhere without a there, or here through which to be anywhere. This means then that this embodiment is something to which we could commit ourselves only through denying the perspective or embodiment standpoint from which we do so. It would be a form of bad faith. One of the reasons French thinkers brought the concept of bad faith to the fore as an explicit philosophical problem is because of the subtlety of the expression in the French language. Mauvais means false or worthless, and in the feminine, mauvaise, bad. Foi, generally translated as faith, also means belief, confidence, pledge, or trust. Thus, la mauvaise foi refers to a wide range of attitudes or dispositions that are not immediately apparent in the English expression bad faith. Bad faith, philosophically understood, is coextensive. It refers to a variety of distinct yet connected phenomena. Belief, for example, could be a manifestation of bad faith. To believe instead of to know requires an element of doubt. Yet, in epistemology or theory of knowledge, there is a notion of a true justified belief or perfect belief. If it were perfect, however, it would have no reason for doubt and would thus not properly be belief. Such a version of belief collapses into bad faith. There's a famous example Sartre offers in response to the phenomenalist, the proponent of there being no distinction between imagination and perception, ideas and things. He asks for the phenomenalist to count the columns of the imagined Parthenon versus doing so in the presence of the actual one. The number of the former is uncertain, whereas that of the latter is specific and certain. The agent creates the image of the imagined Parthenon, the real one, what the agent may wish to be. The ability to imagine, creating images, hints at a specific ability of consciousness. The agency involved is an expression of freedom. It means that consciousness could always reach beyond what is given. This ability has many names in the philosophical literature, from annihilating to transcending to taking flight. The main thing is that it could reach beyond itself. It is thus responsible for whether it stands still or takes flight. If it attempts to take flight from itself, consciousness does so through attempting to be what it isn't. This is paradoxical because the ordinary response, then, what is it really, doesn't work because that would require it being a thing. Even the possessive pronoun its is metaphorical here. This philosophical insight leads to a variety of descriptions of bad faith. It is an attempt to hide from responsibility, an attempt to flee from freedom, an evasion of displeasing truths through investing in pleasing falsehoods, an effort to believe what one does not believe, an effort to see without being seen, that is, to be perspective that cannot be seen, an effort to be seen without seeing, that is, to be seen without a point of view, an effort to be a thing, an effort to flee responsibility for values, an effort to become a god or absolute. There are many famous examples associated with these manifestations of bad faith. Beauvoir and Sartre, famous one of the approached woman on a dinner date that's not supposed to be a date is one instance. Critics take the example as a negative judgment on the woman who disembodies herself as her suitor holds her hand. They miss the point to the example. The point was to illustrate the capacity for disembodiment. In holding her hand, her suitor was outwitted by supposedly holding a thing, not her. In existential phenomenology, there is no separation of mind and body because consciousness, as having to be somewhere, is properly lived or in the flesh. Thus, the approached woman must convince herself that her suitor is touching her hand, but not her. It would be a mistake to read the example of the approached woman as a moral allegory. There are, after all, conditions under which one would have good reasons to be in bad faith. It is not a good idea to be fully embodied during an experience of rape, for example. The same applies to experiences of torture and trauma. Flight into the pleasant falsehood of that not being done to me makes sense for the sake of survival. The approached woman, as I prefer to call her, is an example whose main possibilities offer what Beauvoir calls ambiguity. The basic point of this embodiment reveals a philosophical point in which only part of a story is revealed. We should ask, as well, about the suitor's experience of the hand he's holding. An important phenomenological insight is that one could experience another's disembodiment. He could notice her hand appears devoid of lived agency. This is an important observation because it brings to the fore a crucial element of bad faith. It is social. All the examples Sartre offers in being and nothingness are such. The waiter who attempts to be a waiter thing or object, the accuser who asks the homosexual to admit he is a homosexual, the champion of sincerity, all the way through the sadist and masochist, dominating and possessive lovers, emerge in social relationships infected with an effort to undermine the conditions of what makes them possible. The lies that undergird what the characters in these examples assert are that they are things in some instances, if the real disembodied in others. The problem is that things cannot be social. they are pure externalities. They are without points of view. Neither can pure subjects that see without being seen. Without the possibility of being there, they cannot be a here. To be social, there must be intersubjectivity or communicated points of view. We come then to the philosophical insight that the opposite of bad faith is not good faith, which is a form of sincerity or authenticity, which often appeals to a form of wholeness, but instead, critical relationships to evidence and, in the case of seriousness, play. Bad faith works in one if one can lie to oneself. To do so requires eliminating one's relationship to what makes lies appear as lies, evidence. One must disarm the eventuality of evidence, that is, the ability to appear. Render impotent, evidence cannot interfere with our believing what we want to believe. Philosophers and social theories have used the concept of bad faith to describe a variety of social phenomena. In famously arguing one becomes a woman, Beauvoir in The Second Sex inaugurated philosophical challenges to whether anatomy constitutes destiny. The long line of debates to the present appears in critical theoretical work that may at first not seem existential. Judith Butler transformed this question in Gender Trouble, for instance, into the challenge of whether one must be a subject and a call to explore the possibility of agency without agents. Before Beauvoir, Friedrich Nietzsche interrogated this question of subjects by questioning the values through which they are made. Taking responsibility for such values releases them from their seriousness. Such seriousness, at times called the spirit of seriousness, is a form of bad faith. Nietzsche's transvaluation of values, or bringing value to our values, taking responsibility for them, is a rallying cry against bad faith. Additionally, seriousness turned onto the self collapses it into taking oneself too seriously. Opposing bad faith, there, involves play in the sense of realizing agency at work in the construction of the rules through which life's games or values are played. Not taking ourselves too seriously entails, then, taking responsibility for and a mature attitude toward values and at least what we take to be ourselves. Similar arguments emerged earlier in African diasporic philosophy and social thought as well. Richard Wright was a source of inspiration for Beauvoir. He was part of a long line of African diasporic thinkers who observed the contradiction of white identifying blacks and other racialized groups as human beings whose humanity they deny. Racism, understood in this way, is an attempt to flee the displeasing truth of systematic dehumanization of certain groups of human beings. Relatedly, W.E.B. Du Bois for mutilation of double consciousness, where Black people see themselves as what anti-Black racist societies claim they are, is similar to Nietzsche's argument about the materialization of values. The spirit of seriousness is manifested in the notion of Black people being problems. The moment of realizing they're human beings who face problems is transformative. Instead of being problems, they question the society that treats them as such. The sociologist and philosopher Paget Henry calls this potentiated second sight, which Jane and Gordon later expanded into potentiated double consciousness. This critique of a society that makes people into problems requires identifying its contradictions. For instance, if the options of increased human relations are available to one group but are barred to another, expectations of equal outcomes become ludicrous. If the unfair option are presumed natural or intrinsic, we are on the terrain of seriousness. Demonstrating the contradictions is a form of dialectical critique, in that one move from the self as a problem to the systematic sources of what affects how the self is constructed. Where the society denies culpability, the critique unveils societal bad faith. Frantz Fanon similarly argued that the Black, as understood in an anti-black society is a white construction, and the colonial and racist society is one that attempts to force human beings outside of human relationships. Peter Koss, in his work on structuralism, makes an observation similar to Fanon's in his analysis of Claude Lévi-Strauss' debate with Sartre. Structuralism, as Koss sees it, is an acknowledgement of relationships and rules through which intelligibility results. It does need not be incompatible with existential phenomenological thought, since relations follow from distinctions. Lived reality is, in other words, relational. This argument is also the basis of Koss and other philosophers, this author included, arguing for the compatibility of Marxism, transcendental phenomenology, and existential thought. Existential Marxism and existential phenomenology are not oxymoronic because each is relational. They address alienation through against the closing of flourishing. Thinking, learning, doing, praxis, and all manifestations of human living requires meaning, and those require beings able to affect reality. Of course, there are many kinds of Marxism. Those that assert an ontological or reductive materialism from this perspective simply exemplify efforts to take freedom away from the struggle against human alienation. Materialism is, after all, as Sartre argued in his critique of dialectical reason, a form of bad faith through the illusion of a basic fact. Matters in and for itself leaves no room for its conceptualization. To be a reductive materialist requires hiding the relations through which even matter becomes intelligible. More recently, the concept of bad faith is used as a diagnosis of bad disciplinary methodological practice, where a discipline treats itself as the world, as all of reality, and its methods as complete. Its practitioners forget it's a human-created practice. This form of bad faith are called disciplinary decadence. Similarly to the transvaluation of values, a response to it requires that I call a teleological suspension of disciplinarity. But put differently, practitioners of a discipline get in trouble when they take their discipline too seriously. Doing so takes it out of relations with reality. They turn their discipline inward into itself as the world and treat it as closed. In the human sciences, the result is asserting as problems those who do not fit the dictates of the discipline. Another form of bad faith recently discussed in philosophical and social thought is imposed purity. Such a notion could emerge only by eliminating all external relationships because they would be contaminants and retreating into sterile non-relations. Impurity, however, follows from standing out and coming into contact with that which transcends the self. The human being and social being is in a communicative enterprise that affects every relationship. Jane Anna Gordon and Michael Monahan referred to this communicative interactive relationship with reality as creolization. It is to say that mixture is at every moment of communication and intention. There are many other creative directions in which analysis of bad faith have been taken. For instance, in theology, the desire to become a god is one example. Although theologians advise against such hopes because they are a form of idolatry, there is a problem of theodicy. In an effort to secure the goodness of the gods, the notion of a good or value beyond human comprehension is one instance. Another point to the notion of human beings as intrinsically sources of evil. The problem with both is that they fail to explore the implication of freedom. If human beings are free, that means we have the capacity not only to commit terrible acts, but also not to do so. As Fanon put it, we're not only a no, but also a yes. Second, as Sartre suggests, even if the gods or God exist, neither would be a bad idea. Second, as Sartre suggests, even if the gods or God exist, either would be a bad idea. The reasons are twofold. The first is logical. A complete incompleteness amounts to a full consciousness. Relations would collapse since there would be no longer something of which to be conscious because of the elimination of negation. The second is axiological. Human beings will still face whether to obey or disobey them, which makes them, him, her, or it ultimately irrelevant. I should like to add, however, that Sartre's argument works only where the sacred is interpreted ontologically. The reader should notice, for example, my use of the Jewish formulation God. Under that model, the fundamental point transcends being. Indeed, the question of the openness of God is an obligation of humanity taking responsibility for the ethical face of reality is consistent with Nietzsche's and Sartre's challenge for human maturity. Third and finally, beyond theological and theodician is the basic question of freedom. Some critics claim bad faith is as useless a concept since it appears impossible for human beings to avoid it or sustain not being in it. The existential response is that such critics miss the point. The argument isn't that human beings must be in bad faith. It is that we cannot be free without our ability to attempt evading freedom. We are capable of being in bad faith because we are free. It doesn't follow that all our decisions would be done in bad faith. It only means we are responsible for the decisions we make. Radicalizing this philosophical insight, we learn also that such responsibility doesn't come from the outside, as it were. This means we are responsible for it. Freedom entails responsibility also for responsibility. This brings us to a closing observation. Some critics of existentialism confuse freedom with an absence of constraints. This confuses beings with gods. Freedom doesn't entail the ability to do whatever we wish, where we desire, will indeed become one without responsibility. That would be license. Instead, freedom involves taking responsibility for living in a world with others.